SportsLit is co-founded and co-hosted by Neil Acharya and Nate Sager. Technical producer and engineer, Michael Ella. Executive producer, Neil Acharya. I'm Neil Acharya.
And I am Nate Sager.
Welcome to SportsLit. We are speaking with Ken Dryden about The Class, a memoir of a time, a place, and us, published by McClellan and Stewart in October 2023, coming out in paperback on October 1st, 2024. Is Ken Dryden leaning on his hockey stick? That iconic picture, you know the one I'm talking about. Is that hockey or sports version of The Thinker? Because that's who Ken is. He's authored one of the seminal books in sports, The Game. That was his first of 9. He's been a federal cabinet minister, and all of that after a Hockey Hall of Fame career as one of the greats for the greatest franchise in the sport, the Montreal Canadiens.
Yeah, 9 books, Neil. That means he has authored more books than he played seasons in the NHL. Officially with this book, The Class. Of course, Canadians of our vintage, the ex-Zennials, we know him, I think, more as a writer than we know him as a hockey player, because his career, that was before our time. And he's that type of narrative nonfiction writer where when he brings something out, you really just sort of see the evidence of him thinking as you're, reading through it. Personally, growing up in a home where there were always many books around, Dryden was one of those writers whose stuff kind of always ended up in my hands. So we were delighted when we found out he was bringing this out, because he stated he's had this idea for The Class for about 30 years. I think probably since around the time in the mid-1990s when he wrote a really thoughtful book about secondary school education. It was called In School. He actually spent a year embedded at a high school in Mississauga, just a 10-minute drive away from where recent Morgan Campbell went to high school. So there's a fun fact, if anything about high school is actually fun.
Well, that's a good point, Nate. Season 8, episode 3. Sorry, I interjected on you a little there. Go ahead.
That's all right.
Yeah, The Class is about a gifted group of students, of which Ken was a part of, at Etobicoke Collegiate Institute. From 1960 to 1965, the Brain Class, as they were known, learned together. 35 teenagers identified as the best and brightest. As he writes, the first generation of kids that would grow up in suburbs, that would have the best schools, best teachers, the best and most of what the post-war Western world could offer. Their parents had fought through the Depression, World Wars, and the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. For Ken's generation, the world was their oyster, and Ken's generation's parents would not let them forget it. Dryden explores the lives of this group and ties it into the evolving world around them. So if you want to say, hey, boomer, as a generality, take a second, sit down, and learn something about lives lived, lives that shaped and are still shaping our society, as you will read in this book. We tend to highlight the grand, the stories that stand out, and for the most part, Ken's story is the one that everyone will know about. The 72 Summit Series, winning the Stanley Cup 6 times, earning a law degree in the process. But this is not about him. It's about The Class. It's about Steve Wistonsmith and the Tarragon Theatre. Steve's success came at the same time as Ken was debuting in the NHL. It's about Olympian Wayne Yetman and his pursuit of the marathon. It's also about Sandy Bernard, a labor organizer, feminist, and human rights activist whose sexual identity was just part of her being, just as the previous elements I mentioned. It's about Cheryl Began, a woman who suffered childhood trauma, left teaching for medical leave, and after a career in education decided to get her master's in dance studies from York University. In 2018, at the age of 71, she received her PhD. Quote, she had become what was in her to be, unquote, writes Dryden.
Yeah, it's an extensive project because I think Dryden I've seen him do other appearances about this, and he said, hey, this would only work if I could get almost pretty much north of 95% take up with everyone participating. Now, I have no idea how Dryden or his editors or his long ago classmates would receive this capsule characterization. This is almost like a group project in folk sociology, kind of like all the Keeners figuring out how it went for them. When Ken writes about how one of his classmates came to their meetings with notes, it just queued up, all the type A overachievers from 2010 sitcoms, Amy and Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Jess and New Girl, Jane and Happy Endings. I'll stop right there. You're welcome. But it's also a very forward-thinking book. I mean, it's right. It's social history, but we study history to understand the present, right? Ken's almost 77 years old. He was one of the younger ones in his class, because I think he was a skipped ahead kid as a boy. But I definitely see the sense of taking stock and that feeling of, has our generation left the place better than we found it? I mean, there's ample reasons you can find morning of doom scrolling why the answer to that would be no. But he does remind us things always change by saying the mainstream outlasts every decision maker. Losing the present isn't fun. Winning the future is, and the future lasts a whole lot longer. And that jives something that's been running through my head. Like, the future's undefeated. It always gets here, right?
Well, that's a good point. And just about Ken's writing, Ken, like many great writers, he kind of puts into words a thought that you may have been thinking for a second or for a minute or for 10 years, but you just couldn't really get it out. And then when you read it on the printed page, you go, yeah, he kind of nailed it. And that's his talent. So back to his class, all but one of these students, Ken couldn't trace a lone classmate, have their stories told on equal footing. It's about people, plain and simple. It's about a generation, plain and simple, and it's about Canada. Nate, as we will find when talking to Ken, it's not about standing out. It's about what is relative, what is common. Ken started this book with the question, why? Why am I as I am? Why are you? Why is this place or that thing the way they are? And as the book draws to a close, part of the answer is revealed as humbling and grand unto itself. Dryden ties into Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything, a book he says he really enjoyed. He describes it as the following. The story he tells of how we, that's Bill Bryson, the universe, earth, life, and we as human beings came to be is not impossible or beyond imagining because it happened, because science said it did. Furthermore, the idea that we are a speck of a speck of a speck to almost the infinite power, or as part of something to that same almost infinite power, that is absolutely awesome. And that is said in such an awesome way.
Yeah. Now, before Ken arrives, listeners, this isn't our first rodeo with speaking to a Hockey Hall of Fame member and officer of the Order of Canada. Probably the most noticeable episode connection here is Serge Savard, who was, one of Dryden's teammates on those powerhouse Montreal teams back in the 1970s. And you can find his appearance from 2020, all of our catalog, plus links to buy the books at sportslit.ca.
You nailed it, Nate. Coming up, Ken Dryden to talk the class. Welcome back to Sports Lit. Neil Acharya, Nate Sager. Very pleased to be joined by Mr. Ken Dryden to discuss the class and other topics surrounding the world of sports literature and obviously this book. So, Ken, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Neil.
I'll get right into it. You start the book by writing, quote, I had been thinking of writing this book for about 30 years, and I've always been drawn to the why questions. So why did the life path of the brain class at ECI intrigue you at this point in your life to write this 488-page book?
Well, I think it always intrigued me, and the question about any person, but almost anything. How did we get here? How did we get here from there? And it had certainly been not only a question in my life, but one that was often asked of me. I started playing in the NHL when I was 23 years old, and wasn't supposed to be playing in the NHL at 23. I was supposed to be a law student at McGill. and playing periodically with an American League team. And then all of a sudden I'm in the playoffs and we win the Stanley Cup. And so you get the question a lot under circumstances like that of how did you get here? I mean, how did you come out of the nowhere of Etobicoke, a suburb of Toronto, and Humber Valley Hockey Association and the Etobicoke Indians and Cornell University to the Forum in Montreal? And you get that question the rest of your life as well, and about various other things. I mean, when I left playing and did my bar exams and then worked with the provincial government and did various other projects, the same question is how and why and where did this come from, and how did you get here from there. And so it was always a question for me, the high school class that we had. I mean, we were specifically chosen out of grade 8 in elementary schools in central Etobicoke. I guess we wrote exams. None of us really remembers. We were chosen. We were one of 35. And we stayed together for the then 5 years of high school through to the end of grade 13, and stayed together almost entirely. There were only a couple who left and only a couple who came in. And then, kind of interestingly enough and intriguingly enough, is that very few stayed in any real contact in all of the years after that. So to the greatest extent, we didn't really know what happened to each other, even on a kind of casual note. And so while I had been thinking about doing this for about 30 years, in retrospect, it would have been the wrong time to do it if I had been writing it in the mid 1980s or mid 1990s, because not enough of our lives had happened. That we had run through a few different parts, but we hadn't come to older age and retirement and grandkids, and so we're much more at a stage in our lives now for all of us to kind of think back and wonder that same question of how the heck did we get from Etobicoke and central Etobicoke in the late 1940s and through the 50s and 60s to wherever we are now, all of these years later.
And so were you influenced by in the text we read like 28 up, and the moved and the shaken seems to be kind of in line with this. Were those just in the back of your head? Those were those influences into wanting to do this?
No, I don't think they were influences. I think that I was interested in 28 Up for the same reason as I would be interested in this subject. I mean, that it wasn't 28 Up that made me wonder questions like of how countries got to be as they have evolved to be, or individuals or companies or teams, or, I think that was always there. And so no, I don't think they were influences. I think that they would have intrigued me more because I was prone to be intrigued by a question like that.
And the work, you mentioned that you guys hadn't stayed in contact, the brain class. So the work involved, do you remember the first? Yeah, I guess the first step in that, it must have been pretty daunting. Do you remember what that specifically was?
Yeah, I remember it was just right at around New Year's and I've forgotten what year, whether it was probably 2020, when I finally decided, okay, I think I want to start to go ahead, and the way to go ahead is really to make a start. And so who do I contact first? And there were a couple of people in the class that I had some contact with, and I thought that they would be, kind of a good standard against which to judge the possible interest of our classmates. And so I knew where to find them. I called them, and I just said, here's the idea. And I don't know my own mind yet. I mean, I'm interested enough to think I might want to do it, but the only way in which it's going to work is if all of you are interested, and not just interested, but really feel compelled by it, feel enthusiastic by it, because it's going to take a long time, and it's going to require all of us to think about things that we may not have thought about before, and things that can be awkward, and you're going to have to be willing to work through all of that, because the book won't work unless we have these kinds of conversations. And so what I heard back from them was, yeah, this really sounds interesting and exciting. And I said, well, don't tell me more than you need to tell me right now. All that I need to hear now is that you are at least somewhat interested, and I'll ask a few other people. And again, knowing that it's a book that's not going to work if I can only find 8 or 9 of us, or find 8 or 9 who are interested. 8 or 9 is just kind of a cherry-picked story. The story really is in terms of 35. Once you get to 35, that the lives leading up to those years we shared and the lives leading out of those years kind of become fairly random. I mean, that they cover a lot of ground. And this is a story that needs to cover a lot of ground. This isn't just cherry picking friends from a past time and just writing about them. No, this is also writing about a class, a group, people who had in common, particularly, that they were born just after the end of World War II. That was the sort of defining feature of us and the defining aspect of our childhoods. And so it needed to be more than just a few people. And so gradually it was just, probably for about 2 months, I had these calls, and that each person would, that I spoke with, they would know another person that I, wasn't in contact with, and I talked to them. And then gradually I got to about 13 or 14, and they all seemed to be really interested. And so then it was like, okay, let's make a start.
And how did you just organize the flow of how this was going to work once you had sort of done the deep research, an average of, I think, 14 hours with each person or each person's family members?
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a sort of a process flow, and then kind of a writing flow. I mean, the process flow was, and I didn't imagine it this way, but it kind of turned out this way, of where, again, you start with 3 or 4 people, and then there's a 5th and a 6th and a 7th and an 8th, and it's pretty random in terms of who you're going to be speaking with and on what times and what days. I mean, it really depends on people's availability. And so it would start out that it might be Wayne on the first time I spoke with him was on a Wednesday morning. Well, probably 9 o'clock is a reasonable time for most of us to start, and probably we'll talk for a couple of hours, probably not more than that. It might be a little bit less than that, but we'll figure it out. And so then finish talking with Wayne on a particular Wednesday morning, and then bringing the story to a certain point, and then say to Wayne, well, like, what about 2 weeks from now on a Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock? Well, yeah, sure, why not? Well, then all of a sudden Wayne became every second Wednesday morning, and then Joan would be every Tuesday afternoon, and so I got to a point of where and once I had found just about everybody, it was Monday to Friday, one person in the afternoon or morning, one in the afternoon, and each call would end with same time 2 weeks from now, and it would always be, yeah, sure. And so that was the process of it. And it was, really absorbing, intriguing. I mean, that these kinds of conversations, one after another, through the day. then in terms of the writing of it, I knew that I needed the backstory. I mean, again, this is the story of people's lives, and our lives didn't begin the day after Labor Day in 1960 when we all walked into the classroom at Etobicoke Collegiate. It started in most cases in 1947, in a few cases in 1946. In that way, but of course, we're hugely affected by the nature of our parents and the experiences of our parents, and our parents. My parents were among the older ones. My mother was born in 1908, my father in 1911. Most of the parents were born in around 1915, 1916, 1917. But what they would all have in common is that they almost all would have been affected in some way out of the First World War, their own parents and what happened in that, the flu epidemic of the late 19-teens, and then very much directly they were affected by the Depression, that they would all have come to young adulthood in the early Depression and lived through the early years of their adulthood, of their young adulthood during the Depression. Then they all would have been immensely affected by the Second World War, and many directly affected. I mean, there were many of our fathers who were in the military during the Second World War, and many of our mothers then were at home with us, or in many instances, the families had been kind of put on hold by the Second World War. That our parents met before the war began, maybe got married. All of a sudden, they were living lives of separation. Then the war ends. They come back, and we're born, and we have parents whose lives have been kind of very much defined by and put on hold by the Depression and by the Second World War. And all of a sudden, it's the late 1940s, and they have a chance now to begin living their lives. And they're a little bit older in the beginning of their lives. They may be in their late 20s, maybe even in their early 30s by that time. And they're in a rush to catch up, and a rush to catch up in terms of creating a family, a rush to catch up in terms of jobs and of making something happen, in their jobs. And happily for them is that this was a time of incredible growth and possibility for the United States and for Canada in particular. A lot of the rest of the world was in shambles. Europe was in shambles. A lot of the rest of the world was in disarray with the war over, the great empires breaking apart, the colonial, the colonies of those great empires either getting their independence or seeking their independence. And here you've got Canada and the United States, and all of these possibilities in front of us, which meant all of the possibilities for our parents, and with that kind of an outlook that they would end up sharing, with us.
And indeed, and Ken, how far off or how fair is it to say this kind of the end result of this work? Because you're, collaborating with the first time you described, the person who brought notes to their conversation, I was thinking like, this is almost like a class sociology project done, 60 years after everyone graduated.
It was like that, but in a very informal kind of way. I mean, I think that it was a sociology project that was very personal, and as opposed to something where you're given an assignment and you research it particularly outside of yourself and go to books and things like that. In this case, it was us sort of searching back into ourselves. And part of reconnecting to ourselves was, and some of this, a lot of this, these conversations would have happened during COVID. It was going into the basement and going into boxes and finding old photos and finding old this or that and rediscovering your own self, because you find yourself, one, at an age, in general, of where you're wondering about things like this, but now you're involved in something specific, like the creation of this book, of where you come to realize that this is a puzzling through exercise. You don't know your own answers. You're being asked questions. Your words start coming out of you, and you're not quite sure where those words are going to end up. You don't know exactly what they're going to say, and so that's what it is for each of us individually, and then it also is kind of has the collective effect, because that I'm listening to all of these conversations, and I'm able to sort of, as somebody is talking about their own lives and experiencing this or wondering about this, I'm able to say, well, one of our classmates, found themselves in this kind of situation, and this, did anything like that happen to you? Yeah, that happened. That was exactly how it was. Or no. And so it was this individual exercise of puzzling through one of the big questions of your life and happening to do it with 34 others.
Can I ask one thing before Nate jumps in, Ken, just based on that? I'm assuming you took a lot of ownership over the final results. So when people are telling you these details of their lives, how concerned were you with making sure that their voice was their voice and told in a way that, I guess, told in their voice? And more than that, I'd say, how worried were you about the final reaction, and their final reaction to this?
Yeah. Well, starting with the last part first, very worried about the reaction, and working towards the first part of your question is that I've gone through this a lot in my life. At least since the time I was in Montreal, and maybe at the time, when I was at Cornell, I get asked a lot of questions, and I've been written about a lot, and or been on television and doing interviews a lot, or radio a lot, and where you are in somebody else's hands. Even unless it's live television or live radio, you're subject to somebody else editing what you're saying, and you don't know the nature of that person's story, the angle that they're taking, the understandings that they have, how they take whatever it is that you said. In terms of print, absolutely that. You are totally in somebody else's hands. I don't really trust anybody else's hands in that way. I mean, I've been burned 1,000 times by others who don't quite get it. And it is really annoying when somebody doesn't quite get it, because you're pouring everything of yourself into something, and maybe it's your fault because you didn't express it very clearly, but maybe it's theirs too. Maybe they weren't ready for it. Maybe they weren't prepared. Maybe they hadn't thought about all of this a lot. And all of a sudden, they're putting down something that is a representation of you, and that anybody else who is reading it is going to understand it as a representation of you, or they're going to understand it as you, and that becomes you to them. And so I know what it's like, and as I said to them at the beginning of all of this, is that this is going to be a difficult process as we go through it, and it's going to be difficult at the end, and that all, as I said to them, all I can say to you is my own experience, and that I got to a point early in my career in Montreal where I stopped reading stuff about myself. Even if it was good and people told me it was good and all the rest of it, no, not interested. That is their take. I have to get on with my life. I can't live with their take. I can't live with something that is over the top good. It's too much. It's too good. It's not me. I can't live with their down in the dumps take, because I can't live with that. I got to get on with my day, and I can't have my day overwhelmed by what it is you feel. And I know that when I would read stuff about myself, is that anything that was any good, it got edited out in my own viewing of it. I didn't see it on the page. The only thing that was on the page was the stuff that was either not good or even kind of, inconclusive. And that was written in red ink. And it was the only stuff that was there in that article. And I said, chances are that's what it's going to be like for you. And that the best judge of whether or not I got it right or not is likely not going to be you or me. It's going to be the people in your life that know you best, because the people in the life who know you best know the good and the bad, and they put the bad in the context of the good, and and for the most part, the bad is no big deal, to them. They've taken you in terms of all of the rest, and so it's very likely you read it and you're going to go, oh man, and anybody else reading it is going to say, that was really interesting, that was really good, boy, I'm glad I read that. So that's the long answer to the question of what you were, whether you were worried or not. Absolutely. I mean, that I wrote this, for myself. I wrote it for a large audience, and I really wrote it for the people who were my classmates.
And I just wonder too. You mentioned COVID a couple of minutes back, Ken. I just wondered. You had that passage about hiking the Chilkoot Pass when you were, just shy of 70, and saying that was harder, took a more of a toll than Game 8 in Moscow. How much do you hope this book impresses upon readers? People have been reading you since the game came out, when a few moons ago, that it just impresses the importance of continuing to try new things and rediscover activities. I'm thinking like Judy with the choir as an example.
Yeah, I mean, like, as you know, I mean, when you write something, you have no idea how anyone else is going to take it. You don't know what parts they're going to find interesting, like or not like. You have no idea if they're going to find meaning, and if they do, where the meaning may be. All that I was trying to do in this was really, try to understand 35 different lives as best I could, and try to capture them and express them as best I could. And the fact is that, that among the 35, there are a number of people like Judy who end up finding new interests, and then finding the next interest, and the next interest beyond that. I know that, when anybody sort of asks me about, things that I've done, you always hope that the next thing you do will be more interesting than the last thing you did, no matter how interesting the last was before, no matter how significant it may seem to you or to other people. You hope that the next thing is more interesting and more significant, because it's fun, because it's discovery. It's one of the things that is so why our, one's own family has become so important in your life, is that they become this kind of continuity, but where you are experiencing them in different ways over a lifetime. So you have a certain relationship with your kids when they're 6 and 8 years old, and a certain other relationship when they're 16, and then when they're 26 and 36 and 46. And you kind of come to rediscover the world through them and through
Dryden Peterson,
and through different ages of their lives. And then the same thing happens with your grandkids, because all of a sudden you're re-experiencing life through the eyes of a 15-year-old. And so here you have, Judy, who has some interest in music in high school, some interest in choral, but retires from teaching and discovers a choir and discovers all, the life of that. Or Joan Booty, the same thing, in with a choir, and the kind of totally unexpected moments that you have. I mean, when Joan Booty told of her experience with her choir at the World Championships at the Bridgestone Arena in Nashville, and that they are the North Metro Chorus. And as she describes, they are the superstars of barbershop choruses. The world knows them the way the world knows Patrick Mahomes and whomever. Well, in that world, they know that. And all of a sudden, they're backstage in the darkness, and there are 20,000 people out there, and the announcer into the darkness is saying something. And now, next, for the North Metro, and before they're even able to, the announcer is able to say their name, the crowd is starting to scream. Well, by this time, Joan Booty's, 60 years old, 65 years old, something like that. Pretty nice thing to happen, at that time in your life.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, just telling the story on a parallel level. I mean, obviously you're the most famous person that came out of your class, arguably, especially for sports fans, right? So I thought it was really interesting when the part where you kind of talked about your rookie season and Steve Wistonsmith's, your classmate, acting in Creeps, and how I think it debuted 2 days before you debuted, and then you won the Stanley Cup, and it was a success. So I thought that it was just a really cool, subtle line, but just how your lives intersected. But again, I think the average sports fan would say, okay, this is Ken, this is all about Ken, but you kind of put everyone on an equal footing. And with that, I wanted you to, if you have the book in front of you, to read a passage from page 127, which I thought also was very intriguing, about how you describe what it's like to win the Stanley Cup to somebody that's hasn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I have been asked a lot. And well, anyway, I'll read this part because I think it does go into a lot of the different feelings of it. So it starts, I've been asked a lot what it feels like to win a Stanley Cup. After trying for many years to explain, and from the confused looks I received failing, I tried a different way. I asked the people, have you ever won a championship before in any sport at any age? Really, have you won any big award in any field? They would look at me a little puzzled and say, well, yeah, when I was 10, we won the flag football title at school, as if that didn't count. And I'd say to them, well, that's what it feels like. You're on a team, you begin with hopes, you have good moments and bad. Sometimes you think you'll never win another game, but you keep at it and keep at it. And finally, if everything works just right, you win. And you're so completely excited, you don't step back at that moment and think, well, yeah, we won the championship, but it's not like we won the Super Bowl. No, I'd say to them, you're a team. You had a goal. You worked for that goal, just like the New England Patriots or Montreal Canadiens did. And you achieved it. You won the biggest thing you could win that year. Then I'd tell them the story of how one year we won the Etobicoke High School Senior Basketball Championship against Burnhamthorpe. That's what winning the Stanley Cup feels like, I said.
That's incredible. I mean, I think that perspective is not, I don't think you get that from anyone except for Ken Dryden. So I thought that needed to be read. I don't even know if we need to follow on that, but it stands alone. Nate?
I did wonder, Ken, how vital is it that someone has to love whatever goal they're chasing? Because here I think of, when you reflected on when you sort of studied possibly going to the WHA when that was a going concern, and your classmates who started out in one direction academically and then took that sharp turn into something else.
I think it matters a lot, and I think that I think that the reason why it matters a lot is that if you love to do something, you can't stop yourself from doing it. I mean, that you just do it, and that you do it again, and it's as if time disappears. I mean, that it's not as if, oh no, it's Monday morning, or no, gee, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, or oh, it's still only 3 p.m. I mean, when you're really absorbed in something, then that day becomes night and night becomes day, and weekends become weekdays and weekdays become weekends, and you just don't notice. I mean, you're doing stuff that really interests you, and I've been, I guess, certainly really lucky. In part, probably it's also my nature, for whatever reason, is that I just like to get fully immersed in whatever I'm doing, and so much so that again, it people might say, well, gee, you're really hardworking, or you're really disciplined, or something. No, I'm not hardworking, or I'm not disciplined. I'm just doing. I mean, I'm doing because I really want to do. I can remember, when I was in Ottawa, and we were the government when I first was elected, and I was the Minister of Social Development, and one of the responsibilities that I had was in the election campaign. Probably the biggest promise that was made had to do with childcare, and looking to create a system of childcare across the country. And it was a really tough 18 months that we were the government, because we were a party that was on the way out, and everybody knew it. Everybody could sense it. Even we could sense it. The media could sense it. The opposition could sense it. The public could sense it. That everybody was in the mood of, it's time for a change. And so when that's the case, you just get hammered on and hammered on and hammered on. And we had, as well as all of that, could be the focus of the opposition, is that the Gomery Commission scandals were going on. And so it was my job to try to negotiate deals with the provinces on childcare. And in the midst of all of this noise that was going on, and I thought that I had the best job in government, because I had a mission. I had this task that I knew was incredibly important, that if we could get this done and created, it's like the creation of any kind of system. Once it's there, it doesn't go away. The education system starts, you don't get rid of the education system. The healthcare system, you don't get rid of healthcare system. The same was going to happen here. So this was this mission. And I knew something about missions, because every season is a mission. You have this goal at the end, you're focused on it, you're absorbed by it, and all the rest of it. And everybody else has to go through all of this, yelling and screaming that is going on around, and that nothing gets done because all of this yelling and screaming that was going on, is that I knew something about the prize and the noise, and that you find a way. If you've got the prize in mind, the noise, you go right through it, you go around it, you go over it, you smash it down, whatever it is, because the noise doesn't matter. It's the prize that matters. And that's where your focus, comes. And so that's, again, been lucky enough in the things that I've had the chance to do. And also at the same time, I guess it's sort of just in the way I am, is to just get involved in something, and to a point of where it's not about discipline, it's not about hard work, it's not about commitment, it's not about any of these things. It's just about doing.
And to that point, Ken, I think you write about how you'd always had this idea of being in government, and that was different from politics. And I was just like, how much is it a theme in here when you look at the class, and you were in the baby boom generation and this period of growth and great investment in education and healthcare? How much was this sort of kind of like a rallying cry about just the importance of having the social safety net and government? I'm not even like reading partisanship into it. Just hey, these are good things to have for a functioning society.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's not written as a rallying cry. It's written as an observation. Is that that we grew up at a time when as I mentioned earlier, that Canada was a place of possibility. We were 14 million people in 1950. We're almost 41 million people now. And whatever it is we were is really what we were going to be. I mean, that Canada was on the way to become something, and we had all of these possibilities to help make it that something, and we were this generation that was going to have the chance to go to university in the way in which previous generations did not. Only a handful went before us. Now we could go, to a significant extent as a generation, and what might emerge out of all that. And so, what was absolutely central to all of this was, what's the bedrock underneath the realization of these possibilities? Well, the first one was education, and an education system. I mean, that's why there was the creation of these special classes and of this focus on university, is that if we have all of these opportunities, and our parents looked at it as, here we are at best, high school graduates, if not high school dropouts, imagine what our kids as university graduates would be able to create. And so, and that's why the focus on and the importance of education and of the creation of that through the instrument that was there to create it, through government. That's how it was going to happen. The one thing that was a big surprise to me in writing the book was it was Kathy McNabb's story of her father, who graduated from high school, went on to become a surveyor, then eventually became the Deputy Minister of Transportation in Ontario. But it was the importance of roads. I never thought of roads as being so hugely significant. But there was a time in the province of Ontario, and I'm sure across the country as well, where the second biggest or the highest budget item after education wasn't health, it was roads. It was roads and highways, because this big place needs to find a way of connecting to itself, and these goods that are being created in some place have to get to a market someplace. Mm-hmm. And so roads are huge. Well, then the healthcare system becomes so hugely important. And these were kind of understood, and we were raised with the understanding that these were the underpinnings of the rest of what might be. And so these, and that they were to be for everybody. They were to be done well for everybody. They were going to be expensive. The only, instrument of that where they could be done and created would be through government. And so we grew up with an understanding of the importance of government as how it would relate to the possibilities of the rest of us. One of the experiences in the book, and it's part of the path of our lives, is that by the time we're kind of in mid-career in the 80s or so, starts to become these real doubts about government. It's like, government, I mean, the taxes go up, and what do we see? And the roads aren't what they should be, and the schools aren't what they should be, and what's wrong with the healthcare system, and government gets it wrong. We want, more of our tax money in our own pockets because we can't trust government to do it. And we're living with that in the middle of our careers. A huge percentage of us are in public, have public jobs. So many became teachers. Others worked, with governments in different ways. Some were part of the healthcare system. And all of a sudden, and it especially became a feature in the mid and late 1990s. And I write about Mary McIntyre at that time. Mary is, a teacher. She grows up, where all of her life, education mattered. It mattered to her. It mattered to her parents for her. It mattered to her in becoming a teacher. It mattered to her as she was a teacher, as she was teaching students. And all of a sudden, it's the late 1990s, and it's the time of the Mike Harris government in Ontario, and of where there's the battle between the government and the teachers. And essentially the message, is that the teachers, they're overpaid, over vacationed, over pensioned, over, everything. And the system itself isn't working. And so here's Mary, as she describes herself, and she was kind of quiet, mild-mannered Mary. All of a sudden, she's on the picket lines, in this. And so, the path of our lives went right through a government time, to a time of questioning government, to a time of much more of a focus on the private sector, and having to deal with all of those things and the fallout from all of those things and the impact of all of that on our own kids and now our grandkids.
Very interesting. The concepts of being cool and being different are as applicable to high school in 2020 as they were in 1960. And you actually define or try to cool and being different. And I want to focus on the difference part, if you don't mind. I'm just going to read back to you, not because you don't know it, but because our listeners may not have read the book yet. And this is your quote on being different and people that pull that off successfully. I think these people start down the same path most people do, then little by little discover that this isn't quite theirs and they aren't being them. And little by little discover what is theirs and them and be different, not because their parents are or some character in some book is, but because they are. Then jump in with both feet and just be. So I wanted to ask you specifically, I think most people would describe you as a hockey player as different. Did you feel different as a hockey player? The Canadiens are a kind of, they were a class organization. They are a class organization. But did you feel different as a player and then in management with the Leafs, given what, the players that were on the ice? It was different from who you are.
I didn't. And I think I remember, I get that question a lot when I was playing, and it would be reporters coming up and it would be kind of as an aside and in a low voice saying, like how do you relate to these guys? And And I would kind of shrug it off until finally it was like, no, you don't understand. Is that I may have certain interests that you're aware of that are different from others. That on play and rides, I may have a book out. And I may be reading, and you know that I'm going to law school while I'm playing, and you know some of these other things. But you know something, I grew up in a suburb of Toronto, and I played ball hockey from the time I was 3 years old or 4 years old. And I loved playing ball hockey. And in the summer, I played baseball, and I loved playing baseball, and I loved being on teams, and I shared the experience of playing atom hockey and peewee and minor bantam and then junior B and playing college hockey, and I loved playing, and I loved being on a team. I loved the quest of a team. I loved the working towards something and maybe achieving it, and if not, trying again tomorrow, and all the rest of it. Is that you don't understand. You see the 5 or 10% of me that is different, and you focus on that the rest, we're the same. We have the same understandings, experiences, focuses, priorities, loves, passions, and all the rest of it. And so, and it was when I wrote the game, I knew like that I have read through my life lots of different sports books, most of which I liked, a few of which I liked a lot. In virtually every case, and I can only think of one that wasn't, it was written by somebody other than the person who purportedly wrote it. It wasn't the athlete, himself or herself. It was written by somebody else, and sometimes by a really good ghostwriter. But it's still a ghostwriter, and again, whether that ghostwriter really gets it or kind of almost really gets it, but doesn't quite get it. And the only book that I can remember reading that was actually written by the athlete himself was Bill Bradley's book, Life on the Run. That the other ones, and at that time there was a Bill Russell book called Second Wind, I think. It was written by Taylor Branch, terrific writer, wrote all kinds of other things, non-sports books under his own, in his own name and all the rest of it. But didn't quite get it, didn't quite, grasp it, in that same way. And I just lost my train of thought there for a second. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say you did actually tie in what I was going to ask.
Neil's next question, yeah.
My next question about how those, Bill Bradley book and Bill Russell book tied into what you ended up coming up with.
Yeah, no, that's right. But what I knew, what I believed from having read other sports books, but also books about entertainment, business, politics, where it was a focus on the individual, is that they're all of the stories that they were conveying were all about how this is a different life. And what I am doing is I am pulling back the curtain so that you can experience a life that otherwise you will never experience yourselves. And that's what I'm doing here. I never thought that when I was, through the experience that I had in sports. And so when I sat down to write the game, what I thought was, no, is that there are lots and lots. It's like, when I wrote that part about, what it's like to win the Stanley Cup, is that everybody else thinks that they don't know what it's like to win the Stanley Cup if they haven't won it, but they have, because of other things that they've done, and not necessarily even in sports. And so that what I'm trying to get down is how my life isn't nearly as much different as you think it is. That it still has to do with growing up at a certain time, with parents, of a certain way and a way of thinking, of influences there, friendships, friendships that are broken, goals that you have, goals that you miss. All of those things we all have in common. And so if I'm going to really write the experience of the game, I'm going to write it as I experience it, which is very much like what anybody's experience is with something that they're doing. And that if I get that right, then a larger than sports audience is going to discover it. I mean, that's why in the end, it's sold about 10 times as many copies as other popular sports books, is that because all kinds of people discovered in it that they weren't so stupid about sports. That a lot of women read that book and thought, I have no knowledge of hockey. I don't like hockey. I've never been involved in hockey. I don't understand hockey. I'll never understand it. I have no interest whatsoever, in it. And then read it and go, actually, I do know something about it, because it's all of these things that I know a lot about. And that's what that's why the class is written the way it is. Any of the books that I've done are written in that way, as if they are not singular and unique experiences. If you get at each of the stories, that in fact, they really quite relate. It's why people love novels. I mean, that Alice Munro, who the heck is interested in small town, Southwestern Ontario, this or that? Well, it would seem as if not very many people, except everybody is when those characters get conveyed and you start to see yourself and you see life, through their eyes, then all of a sudden there is that kind of universality to it.
Ken, I know you've given us a lot of time, and we have, I think, one question each, but I want to follow up on that. And when I was talking about being different, and I was just thinking about Ken Dryden being relatable to, by the time me and Nate start watching hockey in the mid 80s, right, that it's a very blue collar kind of game. And I mean, these are the players you're managing by the time they're in the league in the 90s. So I was just trying to picture Ken Dryden relating on a personal level to people that have a completely different experience from him. And you obviously being, an intellect, right?
That we were not different. I mean, here again, you so that I started as the president of the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1997. I can remember after I think it was the first draft or maybe the second draft, is that the teams, I think all of the teams, invited their draft picks back to the hometown and had a week session of, nutrition training, fitness training, all that kind of stuff, just the kind of orientation. And I remember being there the first night. I was invited by the coaches to be there, and I sat amongst the draft picks there. And, so they're 18 years old. And what's the first question? Am I going to ask them? And I remember my first question was, what are you going to do this summer? Knowing that the answer was going to be what the answer would have been when I would have been their age, is that, well, I've got this summer job doing this and I'm doing that. And that's what I'm doing, this summer. And of course their answer was, well, I've got a personal trainer and I'm going to be on the ice each day for this amount of time. Then I'm going to be in the gym. And, that's what my summer is going to be like. I was like, whoa, that wasn't the answer that I was expecting. But what is it that they were really saying in it is that this is something that they do. This is something that they love to do. This is something that they want to do, that they want to succeed at. They want to go from being the second or third round pick of the Toronto Maple Leafs to being a regular for the Toronto Maple Leafs, a superstar for the Toronto Maple Leafs, win Stanley Cups and all the rest of it. Does that make me different from them? Not one bit. And their summers may be different from my summers, but I completely related to them, and I hope in our conversations that they didn't think that I was too much out of a different time.
And how much did that just enlighten you? Just that, because there's so much written and discussed about, sort of the downsides of specialization and in sports and other things. But how much did that sort of open your eyes? Like, well, if this is what someone wants, they need to go for it.
Yeah. Well, it did a little bit, but I mean, our own kids would have been just a little bit older than them at that time. I mean, our daughter would have been, 21 or so, and our son would have been 18. So we would have grown up, we would have lived through their growing up years, which in any field that they, or in anything where they had an interest, it was the same sort of thing. I mean, if they were interested in music, in terms of music, you focused, you focused on music. You took extra lessons. You found special teachers. If it was a sport, it was the same thing. And it was very likely only one sport. We were all multi-sport people. We lived at a time where the understanding was that you wanted to be, that the best way to develop in a single sport was to be a multi-sport person, learning, fitness and being, becoming fit and learning different or lessons in different, the same lessons in a different kind of way. It wasn't a surprise. It was a surprise because I was surprised when I shouldn't have been surprised that they were spending their whole summers at that. But in terms of the nature of the change of how you make it to the top, I was used to that because because of our own kids and knowing what they were going through similar ages.
My last question. Sorry, go ahead.
And I just wanted to sort of sneak this in as a fan of your writing and careers, Ken. I always think he must he's a conceptual thinker. Do you always imagine timeline where you might have ended up getting to the top in another sport? I saw footage from the early '70s of you playing tennis in the summer, and I know baseball's always been a passion of yours too.
Maybe. I mean I never imagined making it to the top in hockey. I mean that seemed, the top seemed another world, not just a distant world, but another world. And so, I mean, literally not until I'm in Montreal and playing in the Stanley Cup playoffs does it occur to me that I'm actually there and doing that. I mean, that even being drafted and showing up at training camp and all the rest of it, it wasn't going to end up, the way it turned out. And so I would have had the same feeling. I mean, baseball was the other sport that I really played a lot of. And in growing up, I probably seemed to be a better baseball player than I was a hockey player, in part because in hockey, I always played 2 years ahead of myself. And in baseball, it was usually a year ahead in it. But yeah, I mean, I love sports and I just couldn't get enough of them. And so far as our parents were concerned, that was great. So long as school, was fine. I mean, that was the big test in it. If
Ken,
school was going well, then the rest was fine.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I thought you'd finished your thought. Thank you for that. So lastly, I just want to picture the class picture, the brain class. And let's say it's just that class for the entire graduating class of ECI 1965. And it's right now, it's tonight. And there's, let's say, an ESL class renting out the gym or going to class. And they walk past that at night and they see that class picture. They may think nothing at all, or they may think, oh, look, that's a pretty uniform picture of old Canada. that would be wrong. And as we've read in the book, there's stories here. What do you hope somebody, when they stop and see that picture, if they're, taking their kid to Beavers or walking by it during the day on their way to math class, what do you hope they see now that they know this book is out?
Well, I think chances are they don't see it.
Yeah.
They just walk on by. But as they walk by lots of things in a corridor, I mean, they're involved in their own lives. They have other things that they're thinking about and focusing on. I don't. I mean, I guess in a lot of ways. What do I think? I think that I hope that they don't think a lot of us in terms of the past. I think I hope that they think a lot about themselves and the future. That this book, to me, as anything that I've done, it's not about the past. I mean, it's about, the extent to which it draws on the past. It's to try to help understand where the present is, how we got where we are, where it seems we're going, and whether there's a better way of getting there. I mean, the whole book, is, and it started with a phrase, and it was the phrase right through the whole thing, is this: how did we get from there to here? That was, our question for ourselves. That's your question. That's the question for anybody who's going to be walking those corridors now. And, that's what they're going to be asking themselves 5 years from now, and certainly 20 and 40 years from now. And the thing that, I taught a course at McGill for 5 years, and I created the course, and I called it Making the Future. And I approached McGill with it as, to say, look, I know that, just as my experience at university was, I learn that, the students are learning about the present and they're learning about the past. And they're going to live another 60 plus years into their lives. What might those years be like? What might they make them? Don't assume that you're a passenger to that life. Imagine you might be a driver. Where do you want to go? What kind of life do you want to live? What kind of Canada do you want to live in? What kind of world do you want to live in? Think in those terms. And so, the extent to which anybody notices those pictures, I hope that they don't just completely dismiss them, but I hope that what their focus is on, is on what, of their making something of their own today, but that here and there they have a thought of that today is only going to matter if I make something about tomorrow. Today doesn't matter if tomorrow doesn't work. The past certainly doesn't matter if the future doesn't work. And so, make something of today, but have an eye on tomorrow as well.
Well said, Ken. Thank you. My dad was born a few years before you and my mom a few years after you. So I certainly got a better idea of my neighbor's experience or someone down the street. I felt enriched by reading the book. And Nate, on behalf of both of us, thank you for giving us so much time. So much.
Not at all. Really good talking to you guys. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Nate.
Pleasure. Thanks.